Hey everybody, today I'm going to be harvesting some potato plants I've been growing in this larger raised planter. I've had about 6 plants growing here, and with a volume of about 35 gallons, I was curious to compare the harvest I get from this crop to a recent one I did with plants growing in individual 5-gallon buckets. I'm hoping to note any major differences and ultimately help guide my future priorities while planting. If you haven't seen that video and are curious about how I got on planting in the buckets, there will be a link to follow down below. And before we get started, I have to note that this wasn't a perfectly controlled experiment, and there's a few things I should note up front. First is that there were different soils used between the crops, with fresh compost in the buckets versus existing soil in the planter. I grew 2 different types of varieties between those crops. And finally, I planted them about a month apart from each other. Now, despite these differences and variables, I still feel that it should give us at least a general and overall interesting idea into what a larger container is going to do for us. All right, I am super excited to see what's in here and compare to the buckets. So let's start digging. That's a good size. I like that. Wow. That's a beast. Look at that one. Well, that one was a good one. It's a goner now, though. In terms of ease of harvesting, the buckets are still the best option, in my opinion. What was immediately clear to me as I pulled out the first few tubers is that individually these are much larger on average than those of my previous harvest, though there was certainly less in overall numbers. Here's what I ended up with. The final weigh-in came in at around 4.4 kilograms. This was a bit lower than I was expecting out of approximately 1 kilogram of seed planted. However, if you consider the large spoiled one being tossed out, it is still roughly comparable on the 5-to-1 return that I got from the first crop. It's also good to note that in this harvest there were 6 plants versus the previous one's 8. The biggest standout for me was the overall difference in tuber sizes between the 2 harvests. The average size of the tubers I pulled out of the planter were at least double what I was getting out of the buckets. Now, personal preference may play a big factor here in which way you go, because I know some people would prefer the smaller potatoes, whereas others are just trying to grow the biggest thing they can. Myself, I like a bit of both. Because of the larger tuber size, however, I did expect that my overall weigh-in for the planter was going to be heavier, but in the end it was actually a very comparable yield between the 2 crops. Whether this comes down to a challenging spring we had here in the Pacific Northwest, or a different variable such as the fresh compost the buckets had versus the existing soil in the planter, I'm not too sure yet. Because of the different variables, I can't draw any hard lines in the sand and say definitively what's going to work best. However, I do have an assumption that going forward, what might be best for me is to test out with larger volume individual containers, such as larger grow bags. I feel this might give me the best of both worlds in terms of the easy harvest, with the benefit of getting a larger tuber size or overall plant for that matter. I hope to continue doing some more better controlled experiments in the future to keep improving the harvest and learning from those experiences. But until then, happy gardening, and we'll see you next time.